planning process or the plan itself, and also an opportunity to provide comment as we work toward a new plan for the next 20 years of growth and change in the city. I want to get us oriented to how the meeting's going to go. So first of all, there are several of us from the Office of Planning and Community Development who are going to take turns sharing information with you and interacting in this online space. And we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves first. My name is Michael Hubner. I'm the Long Range Planning Manager in the Office of Planning and Community Development, and I'm also the project lead for the 1CL Comprehensive Plan. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues. We'll start with Patrice. Patrice?
Hi, everyone. I'm Patrice Carroll. I'm part of the team at the Office of Planning and Community Development that's working on the major update of the comprehensive plan. And this plan, in short, is the vision for how we grow and invest over the next 20 years. So some of the things that have guided this plan from the very beginning, from the early 90s, is what we refer to as our 4 core values: race and social equity, environmental stewardship, community, economic opportunity, and security.
Patrice, I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. I'm very sorry. You kind of jumped the queue. There's a couple of important things I want to share with everybody before we jump into our slides. But that was the fun of online meetings. So patience with us, everybody. I want to make it sure that our other colleagues have a chance to introduce themselves, and then I want to say a few things to the participants. We're also entering. Some people are entering the room as well. I'll give them a couple of minutes to be admitted to the Teams meeting. Jason, why don't you introduce yourself quickly?
Hi, thanks, Michael. I'm Jason Kelly. I'm the Communications Director for the Office of Planning and Community Development. Aja.
Thanks, Jason. Hi, everyone. My name is Aja Hazelhoff, and I am the Outreach and Engagement Coordinator here at OPCD and heading up that effort for the comp plan along with the rest of our team.
Great, thanks, Aja. So I just want to remind everybody who's here with us tonight, this is the 6th and last public meeting of a series that started back in November. There may be people who are here tonight who attended previous in-person events. That's great if that's the case. Love your enthusiasm and interest. I do want to let you know that the information presented tonight is very similar to what we presented in community meetings before, just so you know what to expect. But here's how this meeting will go, and it's a little bit different than what we would do in person, but hopefully it gives everybody this chance to get the same information about the plan, as well as to ask us questions and then provide feedback. We're going to start with a short presentation about the comprehensive plan update. Thanks again, Patrice, for getting us started on that. We'll press reset on the presentation in just a second here. After that presentation, we're going to invite all of you to engage in a 30-minute question and answer session. After the Q&A, Aja will share out a little bit of what we have heard in previous in-person meetings, and we'll also then invite you to provide your own comments through our online tools. During the presentation and throughout the meeting, the chat function should be available to you. And if you have questions you'd like staff to answer, please put them in the chat. Jason will be monitoring the chat and we'll be pulling out questions for staff to answer. For this meeting, it'll be very helpful if everyone can please use the chat for questions only. We have different ways for you to provide comment that Aja will cover in just a little bit. So with that, I'm finally going to turn it back over to Patrice. Apologies for the glitch before. Patrice, why don't you start telling us about the plan and we'll get going.
Thanks, Michael. So hopefully people are at this meeting have heard about our comprehensive plan major update, have maybe, as Michael said, come to one of our meetings or participated in some of the online activities. But we are working on this major update, and this plan is pretty much the only plan in the city of Seattle that pulls together all different topics and looks out long range over the next 20 years to develop the vision for how we grow and invest in our communities and in the city. And it's always informed by 4 core values, and these are values that guided the first plan that was developed in the early 1990s and still guides our planning today: race and social equity, community, environmental stewardship, economic opportunity, and security. So one of the themes of our plan for this round is that we really want to create a more equitable, livable, sustainable, and resilient city as we grow. So some of the issues that we're addressing now are a little bit different than some of the issues that we were looking at in our last update 8 to 10 years ago. So this plan update is really going to focus on racial inequalities from the past and the ones that are still with us today. Displacement, that's something that we hear a lot about, and affordable housing and housing costs. And also, we are now beginning to experience those impacts of climate change right here in our city. So climate change and resilience is another big theme. And the investments that we need to make to meet the existing community needs and also the future community needs, the people who will be moving to the region or the people who are not even born yet who will be living here in 20 years. And then we are also continue to struggle with some of the recovery and some of the effects of the global pandemic. Seattle's growth strategy is one of the 14 elements in our comprehensive plan. And I am going to turn this back over to Michael, who's going to go through some more specific information about that particular element in the plan.
Yeah, thanks, Patrice. So our growth strategy is a centerpiece of the plan. This is our vision for how and where we will grow in terms of population and jobs. I'm sure that you all have experienced that Seattle has been growing rapidly. We anticipate that we will continue to grow. So there are some really important questions about how the city can grow consistent with those values and goals that Patrice highlighted. Specifically, what are the desired locations of new development that will house people and jobs and the goods and services we need every day? And how can city regulations like zoning or investments like transportation or parks and open space support that growth to make sure we have a livable and equitable city into the future? Next slide, please. Our current growth strategy, and in fact, the one that's been in place since the early 1990s, is called the Urban Village Strategy, and it focuses most of our growth in urban centers and villages. Those areas are generally denser, mix of uses. They're in a walkable urban environment in places that are linked to the citywide and regional transit system. We also have places that are specifically designated for our industrial and manufacturing activities. And you can see this map on the right. The dark and lighter blue areas are the urban centers and villages, and they are spread across the city. And then the dark gray areas are manufacturing and industrial centers. The remainder of the city is primarily in single family zoning. Over time, about 83% or so of our residential growth has happened inside those dark and light blue urban centers and villages. We're at a point in the history of the city where there are growing concerns about this strategy, that there are unintended impacts that this update can deal with. One is the reinforcement of a pattern of racial segregation and exclusion that goes back a number of decades in the city and in our nation. Another is the restrictions on housing supply and diversity. And the third is displacement. As Patrice has noted, that's a major challenge for the city, and there are ways in which we think we can design a growth strategy which prevents that displacement and allows us to grow without forcing people out who are residents and neighbors of us now. Next slide, please. And I did see someone raise their hand with a question. We are going to take all the questions in the question and answer session at the end. So hang on to that question. I'm sure Jason is keeping track of who's submitting questions, and we'll come back to them at the end.
Please,
I want to say,
please type your questions in the chat. That's how we'll be able to curate the Q&A after the presentation.
Great. So a couple of notes on housing and housing unaffordability. We are tracking very closely the data, which tells us what I also suspect most of you are aware of, which is the housing crisis, both in terms of availability and affordability. Over the past 10 years, the average cost of a home has doubled after adjusting for inflation in Seattle. And there is an extreme disparity in the impacts of our housing market and housing opportunities for people of different races. For example, Black residents of our city are half as likely to own a home as are the white residents of Seattle. So one of our goals is to make housing more affordable and reduce the disparities based on race and access to affordable housing. Next slide. So I'm going to briefly describe some concepts we're exploring for the growth strategy. I want to tee it up by just highlighting what we're trying to do with the growth strategy. One is to meet the needs of a growing city. We do anticipate that Seattle will be approaching 1 million residents by the middle of this century. To allow for more housing supply and choice across the city, to support more affordable housing, address our history of segregation, reduce displacement pressures, to encourage more housing near our transit investments, and to respond to climate change and with a growth pattern that reduces our dependence on cars. Next slide. One of the concepts we're looking at is called neighborhood anchors. You'll see the map of the city here with a number of blue circles. Those are approximately areas of approximately 1,000 feet out from some of our neighborhood business districts. So several blocks out from some of the clusters of stores that are in our neighborhoods today, around which one thing we could do is provide new housing opportunities so people can access the goods and services that they use every day. It's also a way to support our neighborhood commercial areas so that they can be healthier and provide more goods and services for the surrounding neighborhoods. Next slide. Another idea is to allow a wider range of housing types in our neighborhood residential areas. These are areas that largely are detached single-family homes today, but we have an opportunity to adjust our zoning and the rules that shape development to allow more low-scale housing options that fit in with that single-family pattern that we've inherited from the past, but allow new types like triplexes or fourplexes or even sixplexes that are more affordable and meet the needs of today's households and into the future. Next slide. A third concept is corridors, and what you see on the map here are areas within an easy walk of our frequent transit system. These are areas where if we were to provide more housing choices, such as those triplexes and fourplexes I mentioned that could be allowed citywide, but also could include apartments, 4- and 5-story buildings that are within that easy walk and provide access to job centers, to goods and services across the city. That's our corridors concept. Next slide, please. And finally, there's the idea of what if we did some of all of these strategies? And you'll see a map here that has the anchors, the corridors, the changes to our neighborhood residential. This is a way to provide the greatest supply and diversity of housing across the city, and could also integrate additional changes, such as expanding some of our urban centers and villages to encompass a full walk shed around those really key transit access points like light rail stations. And some new roles for some of the neighborhoods that we have in the city, such as Ballard, which could potentially be an urban center, which is a regional designation, befitting of its new access that the light rail investment will provide to Ballard. And finally, coming online sooner is light rail running up along I-5 and serving Northeast 130th Street station within the city. And we've envisioned that this could possibly be a new urban village around that light rail station. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into all the details on this slide. I want to leave plenty of time for the Q&A, and Patrice is also going to tell you about other elements of the plan. It's not just about our growth strategy, but I do want to point out that anti-displacement and doing additional things above and beyond this growth strategy to prevent the unintended consequences of forcing people out of the city, either because of market forces, that housing is just too expensive, that small businesses can't pay their rent, or directly as development occurs that they may be displaced through redevelopment. One of the things we're doing is seeking to focus more growth and change in areas that are not at risk of displacement. Another thing that we are doing is we are doing an environmental impact statement. This is a study of the different approaches to growth I just described, and we will be evaluating the potential displacement impacts of each of those. And finally, we're developing a whole list of strategies that the city will commit to take in the coming years to mitigate the impacts of displacement on our most vulnerable communities, which tend to be communities of color and lower income, including incentives for affordable housing, providing direct funding to community-based organizations and others, tenant relocation assistance, and supports for existing businesses, among others. I'm going to turn it back over to Patrice to take us home in describing the plan. I know that a lot of people have been chiming in with some questions. That's great. I look forward to some back and forth with the folks who are here tonight, but there is a lot more in the plan besides just the growth strategy, although that is the foundation for the other topics and elements that the plan addresses. Patrice.
Thanks, Michael. So, as I said earlier, the plan covers a wide range of topics. We're just going to touch on a few of those where we're expecting to see perhaps some more significant changes in the plan or where we have particular challenges. But I do want to invite you all to visit our website, and we have issue papers on, again, a lot of these key topics, and that's where additional information is going to be made available for the public to review as we move the development of this plan forward. But one topic that's always of interest when we update our comprehensive plan is parks and open space. And some of the things that may be a little bit different this time around is that we're looking at a much broader inventory of open spaces. So not just the open space that Seattle Parks and Recreation provides, but other kinds of public spaces. And there's many that we'll talk about in the plan that perhaps, so we're broadening that focus to really talk about a wide range of resources. We're also looking to center racial equity. Some of the health outcomes we know are may be related to the amount of open space that people have access to. So that is going to be looked at as part of this update. And also resilience and the role that parks and open space play in making our city more resilient in the face of climate change, be that helping us manage extreme heat events or sea level rise. And then we also want to deliver these green improvements in neighborhoods in ways that don't further displacement in some changing neighborhoods. So that too is a challenge that's really been highlighted in recent years. Climate, big issue, something that I think we see in the news every day, pretty much. So our climate element is going to really be looking to expand, and we have a fair number of climate policies in the plan right now, and we do have our major goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. But there's going to be more in there, and hopefully things that will provide better guidance and better direction for how we can reach ambitious goals like being carbon neutral by 2050. And we know that there's a lot of different ways that the city is already working to reduce carbon emissions, and we can do more. We're already doing things to adapt our building and infrastructure to be more resilient, but we can do more. And mitigating climate change impacts, especially in vulnerable communities, because we're still learning that it's not just the land that's impacted, but it's the people that live in certain places in our communities that are impacted, whether it's because they are physically proximate to some of these impacts. We saw that in South Park just recently. Very vivid images of the people who are impacted in that area of the city, but also because of people's health disparities, that things like heat and wildfire smoke may impact people differently in different neighborhoods. And transportation. This has always been a core element of our growth strategy and our land use policies, and this is going to be no different. And as we plan for growth, it's super, super important that we're also supporting all types of mobility improvements, making it easier to walk, to bike, to take transit, and to facilitate the movement of freight through our city. There's been a lot of change in recent areas in how we get around, or how people and goods move around our city. And so we have a little bit of catch up, but we also have a lot of opportunity to look forward to how we can meet not only our transportation goals to move people around the city efficiently, but also to meet some of those climate goals, because we know that the transportation sector is the one that is one of the toughest to drive down our greenhouse gas emissions. And we are also really happy that we're working on this plan at the same time our Department of Transportation is developing their long-range plan called the Seattle Transportation Plan. So it gives us a wonderful opportunity to link these two very important long-range plans together and make sure that they're aligned in a way that helps us achieve not just our transportation goals, but a lot of those other goals as well. Economic development is also a core part of growth and how we plan for the future. And some of the themes that are coming up in economic development are about building skills and really getting that workforce connected to opportunities. And our small business districts would have had such a hard time during the recent pandemic. So how do we help them not only recover, but how do we help them build for the future? Arts organizations are a big part of our economic development. And again, not just the big cultural institutions in downtown, which have suffered during the pandemic, but the smaller community-based arts organizations are also a key part of our recovery and the ongoing city life. So those are some of the things that we're hearing about and we're talking about as we develop our economic development strategies. And Michael, I'm gonna did you want to talk about the timeline, or?
Sure. I just very, very quickly. Thanks, Patrice. That was a nice overview of some of the main chapters of the comprehensive plan, and there are others as well. So I just want to place today's meeting in a longer timeline for updating the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is a large policy document. It has a lot of moving pieces, and it does take quite a while, especially considering all of the community engagement like tonight's meeting that we want to do during this process to ensure that we are basing our work in what we're hearing from people who live and work and spend their time in the city. So we started this work with a public launch in spring of last year, in March. Last summer, we informed the public about some what we were thinking of studying in this environmental impact statement, which is currently underway, and had what's called a scoping process, where we asked community members, stakeholders, what should we study? What questions should we ask in the EIS? We got, looks like, I was on my computer. Sorry about that. A big window just popped up on my computer that blanked out the screen, but I'm back. We got a lot of great feedback from that scoping process, and we incorporated it into the design of the EIS. We have a scoping report on our project website. You can read more detail about what ideas we're studying, how that EIS will be conducted. And you can expect later this spring, we're aiming for the end of May to release a draft EIS, which will study 5 alternatives and a draft plan. And the next phase of our public engagement will kick off at that time. There'll be a formal public comment period and other events for people to be involved in over the summer. In November of this year, we will start bringing information about legislation that would implement the comprehensive plan, specifically zoning. And another phase of more intensive engagement will accompany that work as we share information about where and how neighborhoods and the regulations that govern development in them may change, and get public feedback about those proposals as well. Finally, in May of 2024, that's our target date for delivering legislation to council. It'll be a draft, it'll be a plan, it'll be legislation, it'll be a final environmental impact statement, and there'll be a process at the city council to consider that work, to get public input at that point, and to adopt the plan by the end of 2024. That's our state deadline. Probably is worth noting that doing a comprehensive plan is a state requirement, and there are a lot of required elements of the plan and policies that we need to address in this process that the state tells us we need to, as a city in Washington State, to do, as well as there are regional and county policies that we're responsible for planning around as well. So we're all trying to work together to plan for the future in Washington State, and this is part of that process. So that's our timeline. And I think it's time to, Jason, I hope you've been doing your best to keep track of the questions and to package them up, especially if people are asking a lot of very similar questions, and share some of those with us and we can respond to them.
Sure. Yeah. If you have more questions, please type them in the chat. We have a long list already collected, and I'll just start at the top and go down through the list. So the first question is from Baxter, and it's about displacement. Can you bring up a specific example of a neighborhood in Seattle or any city in the United States that's experienced the type of growth that we've had in the last 2 decades, population growth, increasing property values, without displacing the existing population? And maybe another way to put that is, displacement is a challenge in all growing cities. How are we learning from our past experience in Seattle and from other cities who are experiencing the same level of growth?
Well, there's a lot packed into. Who is the person who asked that question?
Baxter.
Baxter, thank you for that incredibly rich question. I will take a cut at it. I'm sure we could probably spend an hour getting into that entire topic, but I will tell you a couple of things. First of all, we have been doing a lot of work to collect data that helps us to understand just what's going on with displacement in our city, who's being impacted, to the degree we can, how many people are being displaced, where are they having to move to, what are the forces, what types of displacement are they experiencing? Is it because of higher rents or housing prices? Is it because of redevelopment? Is it because of just the erosion of their cultural communities and they no longer feel at home in the city? We have reports on our project website, both indicators from different neighborhoods and communities in the city that touch on displacement and housing, as well as a dashboard of very interesting data on displacement. We're trying to track that in real time with our data team in OPCD. So we're trying to learn from what we know about what's going on in the city right now. Secondly, that's a great question about thinking about other cities. We are, we have peer cities that we reach out to and talk to and share both ideas of how to combat displacement and also understand what's going on in trends in other cities like San Francisco, Portland, Vancouver, BC, I think come to mind most notably. They're all fast-growing cities. They've experienced some of the same things. And I think that you're right. Displacement is really happening everywhere, and some of the forces in our housing market are, extend beyond just one city, and we're all doing the best we can to mitigate displacement, to reduce those pressures, and to enact policies and programs that help communities. One of the ones in Seattle that has been really very successful is the Equitable Development Initiative. That's a project that grew out of the last comprehensive plan update that provides resources directly to impacted communities to make real projects happen on the ground that help to combat displacement, be they housing, cultural centers, business incubator locations, or other improvements that can help communities stay in place. I think I'll stop there for now. I suspect there'll be other questions about displacement. I know I didn't hit on all the facets of that one.
Here's a question from Christy, and it has to do with the urban village strategy. How is building in condensed urban walkable areas exacerbating racism? And how would letting more housing construction everywhere help respond to those historic patterns of racism?
Sure, that's also a great question. Thank you. The first part of that question, I would say allowing and promoting development in places like our urban centers and villages, I don't think it does in and of itself. And in fact, one of the things I probably should have said right at the start of my description of the new ideas we have for growth in the city is that we value the work that's been done to plan for and create those walkable, vibrant urban centers and urban villages. They will continue to be a very important part of our growth strategy going forward. And all of the ideas that we are considering are in addition to the urban centers and villages. And to get to the second part of your question, we see it as providing more choice to people of all races and a greater variety of income levels to be able to enjoy what makes so many of Seattle's neighborhoods wonderful places to live. And in doing so, acknowledging and learning from a history of practices that go back decades, such as redlining or racialized covenants, and other practices that kept households, Black, Indigenous, people of other religions than the dominant religion out of, and they could not purchase homes in neighborhoods across the city. And those patterns that were established through that history really persist today. There's an economic justice component of this as well, in that we're also more aware of the potential impacts of only planning for new housing along some of our busiest streets and arterials, where there are air pollution impacts or pedestrian safety concerns, and providing more people with more choice of where they live, the kinds of housing they can find that is more affordable for larger households, that complements but doesn't replace the kind of apartment type housing, a lot of smaller units that we're getting a lot of in our urban centers and villages. So it really is about making it a richer future and not abandoning the past vision, but evolving it to recognize all of these challenges.
Michael, the next question is from Angie from Ballard, and it's about small landlords. How are small landlords part of the plan, and how can they help with diversity and affordability of rental housing and broadening equitable ownership opportunities?
I think small landlords are going to be incredibly important. A lot of I suspect there's some small landlords in the audience tonight, and we're hearing about some of these ideas of how we could grow differently in the future, and may have been thinking, and I think quite accurately so, that the kinds of housing that we're contemplating that could be allowed in some of our single family neighborhoods or along in those areas that are served by the frequent transit are likely going to be smaller buildings and maybe smaller mom and pop type owners, or you may be a property owner who is thinking, I may have an opportunity to add one or more units on my property and rent those units out in the private marketplace. All of those scenarios are small landlord scenarios, and they, if we're successful in encouraging a wider range of housing types, are going to be an important part of making housing available. And the city needs to be very supportive of small landlords as we go forward with any of these strategies.
Patrice, here's a question for you, and it's focused on climate. In responding to climate change, can the One Seattle plan also allow enough affordable housing to stop suburban sprawl? And how does the plan reduce long commutes and the loss of farmland and forest habitat that will need to absorb carbon as we adapt to climate change?
Yeah, so Seattle's comprehensive plan is part of a larger framework. Statewide, we have the Growth Management Act that sort of organizes growth on a statewide basis. Regionally, in our multi-county region, we also have a plan called Vision 2050 that again provides that strategy to grow. And I would say that a big goal of that strategy is also to not sprawl and to grow sustainably and smartly. And then we come to King County, and there too, there is a framework where all of the municipalities within King County come together and adopt a certain common set of goals. And again, the idea, all the things that you mentioned, preserving farmland, preserving our forest, preserving our natural resources, growing where we have infrastructure and transit, are things that that all of the municipalities within King County have embraced and express in a set of goals and policies on the county level. So so hopefully that provides a little bit of a way. We're not out here in the wilderness, but we're all planning together, and that's an important part of a whole comprehensive planning approach. Is not that just one place is planning that way, but we're all planning that way together with some shared values and some shared goals.
Thanks, Patrice. The next question goes back to the growth strategies. Given that the presentation outlined challenges with it urban village strategy, why would we consider a strategy that focuses on neighborhood centers, the alternative 2, rather than some of the other strategies that we're considering? In other words, the neighborhood anchor strategy looks similar to the urban village strategy. Why are we considering it?
Well, as I highlighted in my last response, one of the things that we're really focusing on is expanding the range of housing and neighborhood choice in the city to all kinds of people, to people who live, have different needs and preferences in where and how they want to live in the city, what they need on a daily basis. One vision we have for how to provide more choice to more people is this idea of complete neighborhoods. The idea of locating more housing in a neighborhood setting near the goods and services that people need every day, and really bolstering the health and activity that can happen in a neighborhood scale. And what I mean by that is an easy walk from where most, if not all, of the people who live in Seattle, where they can walk to on a daily basis, we think can be met by allowing more activity in neighborhood centers that would, again, not replace but complement the urban centers and villages. And there are many people that can't easily walk to our centers and villages, and there are many amenities and in our neighborhoods that people can have more access to by providing more housing choices, such as triplexes, fourplexes, apartments around our neighborhood business districts. So it really goes hand in hand with this idea of providing access and choice and supporting neighborhoods across the city.
Here's a question about the corridor strategy. Will there be investments in the safety and the appeal of the corridors to make them more walkable? How can corridors be a place for people and not just where people drive? So this is a question about safety and the desirability of living in a corridor.
Yeah, Patrice, you covered transportation a little bit. We could tag team a little bit here. I wonder if you want to start by taking that one.
Well, one thing to recognize is we do have different kinds of corridors in the city. So Aurora is not the same as Greenwood. So each are different corridors. I think also because we have the opportunity to work so closely with SDOT in developing this plan, and they in developing their plan, that we have an opportunity to refine those ideas even more and to get better matches between the kinds of growth in corridors, and to connect that growth to transit and other kinds of mobility, again, walking and biking and all of the new kinds of micro mobility that's popping up all the time. These are things that we didn't think about 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but we'll certainly be thinking about in this plan.
Yeah, and as Patrice also highlighted earlier, we're working really closely with SDOT as they are considering the Seattle Transportation Plan. And on the one hand, I want to acknowledge the kinds of improvements that corridors in any of our new growth areas are going to need. Is more than just transportation, but transportation really is key. It's a linchpin to making these areas successful. And we're working very closely as we formulate a growth strategy for the draft plan to consider what improvements are going to be needed. Improvements to make walking and biking safer, to complete those connections that so people can get to the corridors. An important thing to note about the corridors idea itself is that we're not just talking about the street frontage along major arterials, just that half block facing the arterial, but areas that extend several blocks in on either side of those major transit routes in the city. and the not all of those are as walkable as we would like them to be. And it really is that connection from where people live now and can live in the future in those areas to their bus stop, to the neighborhood store, to a park or to a school within the corridors are going to be really important. So we're working with SDOT to make sure that the kinds of investments that they're envisioning in the Seattle Transportation Plan align with the growth strategy. I also want to say something, and I forgot to say something important in my last response about the anchors as well, and I think it pertains to both questions, is one of the things that I would really emphasize here is that we're not viewing these as either or alternatives, either or strategies, but really complementary approaches that can and should be combined in how the city moves forward in planning for growth. So if we go with neighborhood anchors, it doesn't mean if we're studying them individually that we will choose that path as the only approach going forward. We think a mix is likely the best solution to meet the needs of more people.
Here's a question about parking, another important transportation issue. Many apartment dwellers park on the street. Some neighborhoods have restricted parking permits, but there's often impacts on people who are seeking to park to visit area businesses. How does the plan address parking and specifically this issue of the need to park at small businesses?
So, parking is one of the more complex things that we have to deal with in terms of implementing the comprehensive plan. One thing to be really clear about is that our regulations that address both on-street parking, and that is generally an issue that is handled by the Department of Transportation, and off-street parking, such as parking within a residential development, is something that we enact within our development regulations. Neither of those is detailed in the comprehensive plan. So I want to be really clear about that, the kind of detailed and nuanced solutions that are going to be needed won't be in the plan itself, but we do recognize the challenge, but we also recognize the opportunity, there are opportunities we have here to bring housing, to bring more activities within close proximity of a really rich transit, that including the kind of new connections that Patrice was talking about, new technologies that can reduce the reliance on single occupancy vehicles and the number of cars that are on our streets and the way people are getting to businesses. We think over time can help to relieve the burden on small businesses so that more customers are getting to those businesses more easily without needing to have a parking space. We are working on developing a zoning code to implement the plan and considering the parking needs of new development types as we do that.
Here's another question about changing, allowing for more options in single family neighborhoods as they're currently. When you upzone to multifamily housing, are there also upgrades to utilities, the water lines, sewer lines, and electrical services that you need to serve a growing neighborhood?
Yeah, why don't I start that one, and I'll turn to Patrice a little bit too, because Patrice is working on our capital facilities and utilities elements in the plan and some of the other infrastructure related chapters. But what I can say up front is one of the things we do in an environmental impact statement is ask that very type of question: is what would the impacts be if we were to allow sixplexes or apartments where currently there are single family, we only allow single family homes and maybe an ADU in the backyard. What are our facilities needs, and what do we need to do to mitigate those impacts? In other words, what would the city need to invest in? And that's going to really vary in different parts of the city because we have different capacities in terms of existing infrastructure. And maybe shift, I want to look to Patrice for a moment here in terms of the work we're doing getting ahead of that by working directly with the departments who do that kind of work to plan for and support growth with infrastructure.
Yeah, and there's always a lot of infrastructure planning going on. One of the large planning efforts that you may have heard about, Seattle Public Utilities is doing not a 20-year plan, but a 50-year plan called Shape Our Water. And so they are really looking far out to see how their systems can adapt to growth, can adapt to climate change, and other challenges. So we're learning a lot from those plans, and that factors into how we plan. And not just to accommodate new growth, but to keep those systems viable for the populations that we have now. And again, climate goals are a big part of that as well. How can we do that in a sustainable way that reduces our greenhouse gas emissions, makes us more resilient to climate impacts? Seattle City Light is doing all sorts of technical studies around how much electricity we need to decarbonize our city. So we have more electric vehicles, more really switching our energy sources away from fossil fuel sources to electricity. Like, do we have enough electricity? Do we have the systems to generate and to distribute that electricity? So that work is going on as well, and will factor into our capital facilities element. We collect a lot of detailed information, and we rely on a lot of those very detailed technical studies that the individual departments do. Besides Seattle Public Utilities and Seattle City Light, the Seattle Department of Parks and Recreation is doing a Parks and Open Space plan that, again, includes a lot more detail than what we look at in the comprehensive plan, but we will be learning from that. So they look at individual kinds of recreation facilities, like, do we have enough tennis courts? Do we have enough basketball courts, based on the populations that we anticipate? So I hope that helps to answer your concerns, your questions about that.
Yeah, I'll put it to Capra. I mean, this is a really important topic. I want to recognize that it's something that, as we're talking about growth in the city, regardless of the pattern of growth that we are planning for as a city, the comprehensive plan is the place where the city makes a commitment to and identifies what the needs are and plans to support that growth. And I also want to acknowledge as well that there are neighborhoods in the city that have plenty of capacity in existing infrastructure and local amenities, and are really excellent places to add population and growth. And that's as well a benefit of going through this work with the plan, to identify those places and to focus growth where we, especially in the short term, can accommodate it well and provide people more opportunities to live there.
The next question it's a good segue. Is it possible that we won't see the same rapid growth as we have in the recent past? I know that there were times when the city population actually declined. And how does the plan account for the fact that fewer people are commuting downtown to work? So,
as card-carrying planners, we think about these things every day, I can tell you. There's so much uncertainty that we're planning within, but there are some things we have a pretty good handle on going into this update. The city has been growing since the original 1994 plan was adopted, the first growth management plan that Patrice highlighted in the introduction. This has been an attractive city for businesses. It's been an attractive city based on quality of life for decades. We have had our ups and downs. We certainly have experienced over the past decade one of the longest and most sustained periods of growth the city has experienced since really almost its founding. We don't know exactly what the future is going to bring, but we do have agencies in the region that take a close look at economic trends that provide us with forecasting. The Puget Sound Regional Council, the State Office of Financial Management. We look closely at those forecasts. We are accountable for planning for a portion of those forecasts. We also look at important trends like what is happening to our housing costs and what that says about how well we're keeping up with job growth in the city with new housing. And all of those things suggest to us that this plan really needs to look beyond that uncertainty to make sure that we are providing enough opportunities to meet our growth needs over the next 20, 25 years so that we're not inadvertently driving up housing costs, that we're not displacing people who live here in the city today. And for that reason, what you'll see in the EIS is we're looking at a range of alternatives that are adding to our potential housing supply. We think it's the right thing to do, and we actually think that it's much more likely that we are going to continue to grow pretty fast as a city, perhaps not next year, perhaps not the year after that, but looking at 20, 25 years, the prospects are pretty good that Seattle will continue to be a very successful growing city. The downtown question is not one that the comprehensive plan specifically is going to go very deeply into, but what we are doing at the same time that we're updating the comprehensive plan for the city as a whole is we have just launched parallel work to do a new downtown plan. That plan is looking at a number of challenges that downtown faces, both short-term and longer term. One of the things, speaking of uncertainty, is we don't know what's going to happen with commute patterns and whether people are going to return to working in their offices 5 days a week. If anybody out there knows the answer to that question, I'd love to know what that answer is. But what we are doing is looking at what we can do to be prepared for whatever scenario presents itself in the future. Should we start looking at converting offices to residential? Should we be planning for transportation in some new and different ways? Should we be taking steps to think of downtown as more of a complete neighborhood with where people live and work and go about their daily lives in a more balanced way? All of these things are on the table, primarily addressed through a downtown plan. As an urban center or a cluster of urban centers, the comprehensive plan envisions downtown as a place for both jobs and for places for people to live, so it can accommodate a number of different futures. But we're definitely keeping an eye on that and really learning from the data as it emerges quarter by quarter.
The next question is about the crisis of homelessness that we're currently experiencing in Seattle. We see people living on the street and in our public parks. What is the role of the plan in responding to impacts that this is having in our neighborhoods? But I would also say, how does the plan help the city respond to the crisis of homelessness that we're seeing on our streets every day?
So perhaps I'll tag team a little bit with Patrice here. Let me just say a couple of things about growth and the growth strategy, which is really at the core of the comprehensive plan. Over the longer term, and this is a long-range plan, we think one of the best things that we can do to reduce homelessness is provide sufficient housing for people in the city and in the region. We are now responsible under state law to show that we are accommodating and supporting housing that meets the needs of all income levels. And the state has provided us with estimates of how many housing units we need for the very low income, moderate income, and also for the kinds of housing that serves directly people who are experiencing homelessness. Emergency shelter and permanent supportive housing for folks that need housing and services on site. So there's a new framework where we are looking very directly at what the needs are over the longer term. Now, there are a lot of short-term challenges that the comprehensive plan less directly can do very much about. But I'm going to turn to Patrice. I do want to acknowledge that there are elements of the plan that cover things like human services, quality of life, aspects of how we plan for the future that I think relate to the topic.
Yeah, I would say at a high level, but of course, the detailed implementation planning is quite complex, and especially now that we have a regional homeless agency sort of taking the lead on some of those very specific kinds of investments. So what the comprehensive plan can do is communicate what the general direction is, but it wouldn't include sort of very specific investment strategies.
Here's a question going back to transportation. How do we ensure that appropriate public transit investments are made alongside changes to encourage people to live in walkable areas, so that not everyone needs a car? Are we investing in transit alongside changing the patterns of how people live in Seattle?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And there's a bit of a chicken and egg aspect to the answer. I mean, one of the things we're doing out of the gate with that is looking at where we are making transit investments now. We know where Sound Transit is building new light rail stations. We know where there are rapid ride lines exist now, and where they may be expanded in the coming in the coming years. And remember, this is a 25 year plan, so we're really trying to look out as far as we can, and with an understanding of where our transit investments are going to be. And so a lot of what you'll see along the IUB, the neighborhood anchors or the corridors, the urban centers and villages, are very responsive to where we know the transit is investments are being made, and making sure that we are leveraging those investments. That means those are great places that people are going to want to live. Developers are going to want to build there to leverage those investments, but also make sure we're supporting the transit agencies with the kind of ridership that's going to support those systems by providing homes and businesses near the transit. And I think probably the biggest difference with some of the ideas we're looking at with this plan is to take a more inclusive and complete look at our transit system today and what it might be in the future in terms of serving corridors across the city and neighborhoods across the city. And we are talking about where could we plan for some new locations for growth to look beyond what our current investments offer. Where might new or future neighborhood anchors be located? What corridors don't have the transit that may support denser growth today, but might in the future, and getting ahead of that in the vision that we paint in the plan for the future. So that would require, of course, the commitment of our transit agencies and the region to invest in those places, but it starts with a vision for the future of the city that we want. But again, primarily, we are focusing on the transit investments that we know are going to be coming online.
Here's a question about historic preservation. How do we value historic preservation in the plan, and while also looking at where to add new homes? How does the plan respond to the historic districts that we already have established in our city?
So that's a rich topic that our environmental impact statement is going to explore in some detail. And in fact, City Council asked us to take a closer look at the historic and cultural resources in the EIS. So it's something that we'll have a lot more and better data on going as we formulate a final plan. We're also doing that work in a way that is more culturally inclusive. Historically, if I could use that term to describe historic resources analysis, but in the past, it has not included some of the historic and cultural resources that are important to communities of color, for example. So that's another way in which our historic resources analysis will be richer. So we definitely be looking at mitigating impacts on important resources as we look at where we plan for growth, and both in the growth strategy and in zoning, and recognize that we can do both. We can preserve what's important historically, and there's a lot of room to grow in the city.
Here's a topic that we have heard a lot about in the public meetings. How does the plan address the urban tree canopy, and how do we preserve the important trees that we have in the city of Seattle?
Well, for folks that are interested in tree canopy, you're going to be really interested in the environmental impact statement analysis. So tree canopy is going to be analyzed as part of that. So we'll have better information about what the impacts will be given alternative 1 versus alternative 2, et cetera. So I think that will enable us to have a really robust conversation about what kinds of policies we might need to mitigate that loss given different alternatives.
Yeah, and specifically what that may look like, and as we're starting to think about what kind of zoning may be needed to implement any of the ideas that we talked about in the growth strategy, if we're talking about adding housing in what are currently primarily single-family neighborhoods, of course there are a lot of existing significant trees, and looking at different ways that we can development standards, setbacks, heights, incentives that may be built into our zoning code specifically to address and mitigate impacts on trees. We certainly have a lot of choices, and that's one of the things that, looking at what some of our peer cities have done in planning for what is generally termed that missing middle housing and infill. So it's definitely something that we're considering and thinking about the regulatory piece of this, because again, the plan itself won't have the provisions and the approaches that are going to have an impact lot by lot, parcel by parcel, tree by tree. But we will learn generally about which direction we take and generally what potential impact it will have on the tree canopy. And then we'll be looking at the regulatory approaches that can achieve both growth and new housing and preserve the trees that are important.
Here's another question about displacement. I know we touched on it in a little bit earlier in the conversation, but I think this is an interesting nuance. So this person lives in the Central District and is asking, how do we plan for safeguards for cultural identity of the Central District, and how do we prevent gentrification and increasing the risk that folks will be displaced?
Yeah, but that's such an important question. I mean, to start with, we're very aware of the displacement, the ongoing, but both the historically what has happened in the Central District with regard to the displacement that's already occurred, and we know that it's been really massive in terms of the displacement of the community that historically lived there. It is still an area of high displacement risk, and as such, the kinds of approaches that I briefly described before about planning for relatively less change and development in an area that has that high displacement risk and more in other parts of the city is something that would apply. As well, the displacement strategy or a toolkit that we're developing that will accompany the plan. There are a lot of those tools that I think will grow out of the experience in the Central District. The EDI, Equitable Development Initiative program, I think, is a good example of, now we have several year track record of projects that have really been really beneficial. And I would hope that we can learn from that and envision future investments in the central district that can help to build resilience in the community that is there now. There's certainly the idea of providing housing opportunities for people who want to return to the central district is another important element of how the city may approach that particular community, and either through preference policies for affordable housing, and or I would argue the kind of housing market rate housing opportunities that the plan could potentially provide for could be opportunities for existing historic homeowners, Black homeowners in the central district in particular, to redevelop on their properties in a way that builds community wealth and also provides housing that people need, be they current residents or people who want to return to the area. So there's a lot to talk about there. We think that our approach is very consistent with a comprehensive, really all hands on deck approach to strengthening the community in the central district and make sure this plan works for them.
There have been so many great questions tonight, and we're running out of time. When we want to provide a little bit more information about the public meetings that we've had, what we've heard, and also share with folks how they can continue to ask questions and provide feedback as the plan develops. But I think we have time for one more. And Patrice, this one might be up your alley. It's a question about municipal golf courses. And I know this is an issue you've been working on a little bit.
Sure.
With our city's climate change goals and housing crisis, has there been any thought about repurposing existing municipal golf courses?
Yeah, so this question has come up a lot as we've been doing some station area planning around the 130th station, which is the next light rail station that will open in the city of Seattle. And it's right across the street is the Jackson Park Golf Course. So this has been a natural question is should that land be redeployed to provide housing or other uses? And it's a tough call because parkland is also very valuable and it's very expensive to acquire new parkland, and the city of Seattle hasn't been acquiring much new parkland. So Parks very much wants to hold on to every single inch of parkland that they have. So right now the city's policy is not to use parkland for other uses. That policy could change in the future, but right now that is the city's policy, and there's no direction to change that. I think one thing that's being talked about a lot is how that parkland is used, and if we need all of the golf facilities that are there, or if there could be some change in the future to have other kinds of recreation uses on that site. And that's something that certainly Parks that question is going to come up as Parks develops its 10-year park and open space plan. That's the kind of question that they'll be looking at their whole system and all their facilities and perhaps make some decisions or have some new directions. So that's certainly one of the things that we also learned as we looked at that area was that the areas of the Jackson Park Golf Course that are closest to the station are some of the most environmentally sensitive areas of that very, very large parcel. So as much as we would like to build new housing close to the station, building it on those in that particular area on parkland is probably environmentally not a very good idea. So so that's some of the things that we heard and that we've learned so far through some of the specific planning we've been doing for 130th.
So maybe we should advance the slide and we can share more about what we've been hearing in the public meetings we've been holding over the past several months, and also how you can continue to stay engaged.
Thanks. So we wanted to just acknowledge that this is the sixth meeting of 5 meetings following 5 meetings that have already taken place in communities across Seattle. So we held meetings in New Holly, in the Central District, in West Seattle, Loyal Heights, and Meadowbrook. I think probably many of you have heard about that or were actually in attendance. This obviously is the virtual companion to those community meetings. And we just wanted to report out, just share sort of how the data that we'll be hopefully collecting from you all today, including your comments, your questions that you can email, or as I'll show you in the next slide, how you can get onto the engagement hub and leave your comments there, but how that conversation kind of compares to the open house style and small group discussions that took place in the community meetings that were in person. So we actually saw similar numbers to the amount that have gathered here tonight. And from that, we've received over 3,000 feedback comments. And that's come in the form of notes that we're taking during the in-person breakout sessions that were taking place in the in-person meetings, as well as comments that people had left on sticky notes that were put on posters all around the periphery of those in-person meetings. And so this is just another opportunity to share additional feedback. And so before that, though, I wanted to share out, Patrice, if you could advance the slides, a little bit about what we've heard, just to give some context to this meeting. In the community discussions, we talked there were two different topical sort of structures that we worked around for the in-person meeting discussions. The first really centered around housing, and what we heard from folks there were the different types of housing that they were looking to see in their communities over the course of the next 20 years. So obviously affordability was a central comment that we heard. And specifically, we heard about the need for more options for more types of housing, such as condos and stacked flats, quadplexes, and more family-sized units. And that's both speaking to the size of the family and also just multi-generational houses. So different housing needs for different types of families at different stages in their life, as well as the issue of the accessibility of the homes themselves. As far as where folks were expressing their desire to see new housing created in the future, the central thing that we're hearing is that there's a lot of support for more options throughout all of Seattle's neighborhoods. This includes homes that are located with great access to things like transit and parks, and that are really considered a walkable neighborhood. So new housing, the main thing that people were really hitting home again and again was to talk about access to different amenities, and the location of new housing should really be centered on access to great transit, great parks, and other amenities that they identified. Another section of those breakout sessions were titled Complete Communities, because we really wanted the discussion to explore what participants loved and also felt were missing from their neighborhood. So in terms of what people identified as really valuing and loving about their neighborhoods was proximity to parks and amenities. And within this, we really found a trend of people talking about third spaces, which third spaces can be described as places that aren't your work and aren't your home, but it's a third space where you can relax. And finding places where people can build community and not always at a cost was something that we heard a great deal of appreciation for when people were describing their neighborhoods. Another thing that we heard a lot about was how much people liked having access and walkability to grocery stores, to things like coffee shops, restaurants, different things in their neighborhood that gave them a sense of community and a place to gather. And then, of course, along with proximity to parks, there was a lot of discussion around trees and green spaces and the importance of these in both the identity of communities, but also in people's experience of their communities, as well as the environmental benefits and climate impacts that would be mitigated by having access to increased amounts of tree canopy and green spaces. In terms of what was missing from people's neighborhoods, Conversely, third spaces and community spaces both were identified as often and frequently missing from neighborhoods, both in terms of the maintenance of facilities that were there, the accessibility in terms of how close it was and how what kind of transportation was required to get to those places. Definitely something we're hearing is a lack of safe streets for bikes and pedestrians. And so investments that are missing in their neighborhood really speak to both the ability to get in and out of your neighborhood, but within your neighborhood to be able to get around safely, no matter your choice of transportation. One of the other things that people frequently talked about was a lack of diverse housing choices. So not just affordability, but in terms of what people can get with what they have. So that diversity as well as the affordability is something that people were constantly bringing up. Public restrooms was something that really stood out to me as being across all of the meetings, something that folks again and again brought up. And this was in the context of both these third spaces and community spaces, but as well as parks. Public restrooms is something that many community members felt was missing. And then finally, one of the things that people talked about was access to grocery, restaurants, and childcare options. So these amenities within their neighborhood that they can easily access are something that was frequently identified as being something that was missing. So this is all just a snapshot, obviously, and very anecdotal kind of sharing out of the kinds of things that we're hearing. A lot of them probably are unsurprising, but I think it's important for us to go through, and maybe you could advance the slide, because these are the types of things that we're hearing, and it all comes from analyzing and our policy staff really digging into this data. And the best way that we have found, excuse me, to do that is through our engagement hub. So on the back end, when we have in-person meetings, we really upload and digitize all of that information, and it goes to the central place. This is important to note because we're encouraging all of you all tonight to visit our engagement.
Aja,
You're muted,
just
Aja.
muted yourself.
Oh, I don't know how that happened. Sorry. I'm in the middle of encouraging you all to take advantage of our engagement hub, which is where we hope to get sort of the last round of engagement data from you all tonight. And what we've done is we've taken all of the discussion questions, the same questions that we asked the breakout groups and the in-person meetings, and we've just popped them onto the engagement hub in the form of a survey. And I think, if possible, Patrice, are you able to?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that now.
So what we were hoping to do, if the tech gods will allow it, is just to show you visually what we mean when we say to go to the engagement hub. For this action that we're asking you to take, which is to leave meeting feedback, the same questions that were posed as at the in-person meetings. Oh, great, I think it's working. So we'll have you all navigate to the engagement hub, which I've put a link to that, like where you should go in the chat. And up at the top, Patrice, you can see that it says join us community meetings. So if you could click there, that will take you to the landing page for all of these community meetings. Then at the bottom right, it will say take the survey. This is where we've put all of the question prompts that we use at the in-person meetings, and you can submit your feedback directly there to all of those. Patrice, if you could navigate back one page. You can also, on this site, see, I saw a lot of questions in the chat. All of the meeting materials, including the recording of this, where we are right now, this online meeting, as well as the questions and the meeting materials from the in-person meetings, which are a large part of sort of what we drew on to create the presentation for tonight. you'll be able to navigate to those as well. And we will put the slides, Jason noted that we would put the slides on the OPCD's website, but we'll also be putting them on the Engagement Hub. So if you have a question about any of the meeting materials, and especially if you would like to leave comments to be folded into sort of where we got the sort of what we heard that I was just anecdotally sharing, this would be the place to go to do that. If you have questions, as Jason was saying, that weren't answered during the community meetings, you can also navigate to the Engagement Hub and leave comments there, or you can email us at oneseattlecomplan@seattle.gov. I'll put that in the chat as well, and we'll try our best to get back to you with responses. But in the meantime, sorry, Patrice, I'm trying to follow along. If you could provide that input on the Engagement Hub, we'll fold it in. That will be available to everyone through the end of the week, at which point we'll be closing the comment period and just focusing on getting out our report out from the community meeting series, of which we'll be incorporating the feedback data from tonight. And I'll turn it over to Michael to just bring us home with a snapshot of what's to come.
Yeah, Asha, thanks so much for giving us a nice view of what we've been doing to reach people in the community, what we've heard, and most importantly, if you have questions, I'm going to reiterate the big points here. If you still have questions you didn't hear answered, how you can contact us with those questions, and especially we want to hear your ideas, your comments, and there are ways both directly via the email or especially the Engagement Hub to provide us with feedback, with input. The deadline, when did you say the deadline was, Asha?
It's this Friday.
Yeah, now I want to be clear about that too. We will take comments and questions after Friday. The only purpose of the deadline is we want to put out a summary report of what we've heard from the community. If you get us comments after that date, those comments will be included in the next time we report out on what we've heard. This is an ongoing process, so you won't miss anything and you will still be able to shape the plan even if you don't make the Friday deadline. Just wanted to be super clear about that in case anybody felt rushed. With that, so that's a good segue to what's next. Again, well, February coming up right around the corner, we will be reporting out from the community meeting series. That's just a way for us to be transparent, to provide you information, provide the general public with information about what people have been talking about in these online and in-person community meetings. The input we received during this process will help shape the draft plan that we will be releasing later this spring, and what we learned from the draft EIS, which will also be released at the same time, and how we work to develop the plan from there. In spring, summer of 2023, after we release those draft materials, there will be a public comment period. There will both be a formal public comment period in response to the environmental impact statement. That's a state requirement. There'll be ample time for people to learn about the EIS and to provide comment. But there will also be an opportunity to comment on the draft plan itself. And that engagement around the draft plan will extend even longer as we continue to do this work going into 2024 when we transmit the final proposed plan to council. So just wanted to paint that picture for all of you. If you have any questions about the process or the schedule, please contact us. It's a complicated and long schedule, and I know that sometimes it's difficult to follow all of the moving pieces, but we want to make sure that you feel comfortable that you have the opportunity to weigh in. With that, thanks again so much there's 82 people still here, which is fantastic. We lost a few along the way, but not too many. And thank you all for being here, for asking really great and really difficult questions that we're all wrestling with when we consider the future of the city. And we welcome all of it, and stay in touch, and have a great rest of your evening, and stay dry and warm. Thanks,
Thank you,
Holly.
everyone.
Okay,
Everyone.
bye-bye.